try to help people.
You're patient, with a good ear, and you try to help people.
Yes.
When you're not trying to murder them.
Yes.
When Kallinger's reign of terror ended, 3 were dead, including his 14-year-old son.
You murdered your own son?
Yes, I did.
Why did you do that?
He was a sacrifice. I was to murder 3 million people on planet Earth. And he was a sacrifice to see if I could murder one of my own. At the end of murdering all the people on Earth, I was going to murder my own family and then take my own life and become God.
What do you think of the death penalty?
I'm opposed to it.
The state has no right to take your life, but you can murder other people?
I don't think anyone has the right to take a life.
Except you?
When I'm under hallucination, I do.
These voices from God, these hallucinations, do you still experience them?
Yes, I do.
Often?
Often.
Do you ever feel violent?
Yes, I do.
What do you feel like doing?
Killing people.
You still feel like killing people?
Yes.
Describe the feeling that you get when you feel like killing people.
Well, last March 11th, I was hallucinating, and I took a razor blade and I cut a man's throat.
Here in the hospital?
Here in the hospital.
Do you think you'd murder me, Joe?
Yes.
That's gruesome, Joe. That's horrible.
Yes, it is.
And you don't blame me if I say I hope you never get out of this place.
I hope I never do either.
Born into hardship, twisted by trauma, and compelled by voices only he could hear, Joseph Kallinger went from being a troubled boy in Philadelphia to one of America's most disturbing serial killers. His story raises an age-old question: are killers made or born? Today, we dive into the haunting life of Joseph Kallinger, a life that explores the depths of nature versus nurture and the terrifying consequences when a disturbed mind is pushed beyond the edge. Joseph Kallinger's life began in December of 1935. Just 2 years later, in December 1937, he was placed in foster care. Just shy of 4 years old, on October 15th, 1939, he was adopted by Austrian immigrants Stefan and Anna Kallinger. But this adoption was no adoption out of love. It was strictly business. The Kallingers wanted a child not to love, but to mold, someone who would inherit and expand the family business. Joseph was raised under hard and unusual discipline, with the purpose laid out for him before he can even comprehend what life was. But this abuse and mental strain would turn this child of purpose into a man consumed by darkness. At just 5 years old, he would be playing in the playground when he would hear the word fuck. When he would go home and ask what it meant, he was nearly beaten to death for this. His life became a cycle of beatings, humiliation, and neglect. His adopted parents saw him only as a tool to make shoes and nothing more. A curious and impulsive young Joseph, just a few months later, would get sent to the principal's office for pulling down the pants of a little girl. When his parents found out, his mother beat him with a wooden spoon while his father joined in. They punished Joseph's curiosity ruthlessly. And the beatings wouldn't just end at home, when one day Joseph would be sent to the nurse's office after getting kicked in the balls by another student. This would result in Joseph getting a hernia. This was the only time that the Kallingers showed any care towards Joseph, because if he was hurt, he couldn't work at a cobbler at their shoe shop. At the age of 6, just after his hernia surgery, the doctors would diagnose Joseph with schizophrenia, a disorder that his adopted parents would only worsen. His parents told him a demon, a little bird, lived inside his head. They said the doctor performed a second surgery on him to stop the little bird from growing. For now, they even convinced Joseph that this demon would grow if he disobeyed. This planted a seed in his mind, leaving a young boy confused and scared. This would lead to his first visual hallucination. Once his parents sent him to bed, Joseph would stand and stare at the full-length mirror that faced the stairs. He would see a floating knife with his penis severed at the tip of it. Frightened, he grabbed his crotch and the hallucination disappeared. Joseph began developing disturbing obsessions, and later on, more violent fantasies. This in part due to his mental illness, and in another part due to his parents' cruel punishments. Like when at 7 years old, Joseph would have to go home, sit on his knees on sandpaper for an hour every day after stealing a prayer book from school. And like when at 8 years old, an eyewitness claimed to have seen Anna Kallinger, his adopted mom, beat Joe on the head with a hammer. To escape, he found solace in places that no child should, like an oil tank near his home that he would climb down to into the dark and sit for hours. However, this little piece of his turned dark when one day he would climb down and see 3 other boys performing adult activities to one another. A shocked little Joseph would try to leave, but they would soon see him, grab him, and SA him. On his 9th birthday, when he had to remind his mom that it was his birthday, he would ask if he would receive a present this year like all the other kids in his class. His mother laughed and said,
"Gifts are not for greedy little boys."
Joseph arrived at school that day and felt something he never felt before: resentment towards his classmates. What made them so good and me so bad and greedy? Enraged, he snuck into the class closet and slashed the coats and buttons of all his classmates, and miraculously was never caught. His mental health was spiraling, yet he received no support. Instead, he was repeatedly punished and reminded of his place in the world: to be a shoemaker. Any dreams he had were instantly crushed. In his teenage years, things only got worse. Joseph, desperate to belong, began to steal quarters from his parents to take his friends to the movies. When his parents found out, they grabbed Joseph and held his hand over the stove flame to turn away the thieving demons. He endured this punishment 5 more times before finally stopping and giving up. His mind continued to fracture. By age 14, he experienced his first auditory hallucination that instructed him to harm others. In 1949, Joe would steal one of his father's shoe knife and go to the bus stop. Once on the bus, he would see a boy leave and follow him. Joseph then pulled out the knife and instructed the boy at knife point to go into the forest. He then instructed the boy to pull down his pants. Playing with the knife and pondering, Joseph stared, turned around, and ran off into the forest. He would do this a few more times before finally ramping things up, where then, after telling the boys to pull down their pants, he would run up to them and bite their genitalia, and after they let out a scream, he would run off into the woods. This was a confusing time for Joe. He was trying to figure out who he really was and where he fit in this world. In search for an identity, he decided to try something new. He auditioned for the school play and actually got the lead role of Ebenezer Scrooge. This was a huge moment for Joe. He loved every second of the spotlight, and the praise he would receive afterwards would give him a whole newfound confidence. Excited to share his experience with his parents, he rushed home and told him of his dream. He wanted to be an actor, but his parents scoffed and told him to act for them right then and there. As he nervously recited a line from Shakespeare, they laughed and threw water at him, telling him that he would never be nothing more than just a shoemaker. Deflated, Joe accepted his role in life and decided to focus on making shoes. But things didn't get any better. As Joe's sense of purpose slipped away, so did his focus in school. His mental health started to unravel, and he began having episodes where he would laugh uncontrollably for no reason, rolling around the floor in front of his parents. And instead of seeking help for him, his parents decided to fortify their bedroom and sleep with a bat next to their bed, treating him more like a danger than a son. Because after all, his skills as a shoemaker were improving, and that's all they ever wanted from him. Joe's only real escape became his Saturday night trips to the movies, where he could disappear into other worlds for a few hours. During one of these outings, he met a girl named Hilda Bergman, and he would fall fast for her, becoming his first love and even losing his virginity to her. His parents strongly disapproved, but Joe didn't care, because for the first time, he finally had something that felt like his own. Pushing against his parents' control, asked to be compensated for his work at the shoe shop, and surprisingly, they agreed, but at a cost. They would then begin to start charging Joe rent, making sure he was still under their thumb. Still, Joe was content at this point, actually feeling proud of the work he was doing. Even in his mind, he felt that God would even approve. He finally believed that he was actually doing something right for a change. But beneath this pride lay a brewing storm. Joe would experience his first full-blown audio and visual hallucination and claimed to see God himself in his room. God would say that he was proud of Joseph for the work that he was doing, healing people through the feet. But now he had a specific mission for Joe. Joe was to control people, because the feet are connected to the mind, and Joe would control people through the feet. This was his mission from God, God's mission. At just 15 years old, Joseph Kallinger would decide to move into his own place, a decision that his parents were more than happy to support, since they were extremely terrified of him at this point. This marked the first time in Joe's life that he was actually able to make friends, though his relationships were hardly normal. His relationship with Hilda continued to blossom. However, there was something unsettling about it. Joseph could only be intimate with her if he held a knife in his left hand, his power hand he called it. Despite this, he would go on to marry Hilda at the age of 17 at 1952. Shortly after marrying Hilda, Joseph would soon drop out of school to work full-time at the shop, seeing himself as an integral part of the family business. By 1955, Hilda and Joe would have their first child, a daughter, and by 56, their son. They would name the kids Stefan and Anna after Joe's abusive parents. Hilda was not the nurturing mother that Joe had hoped for. She was neglectful and verbally abusive, often mocking Joe's little bird. As their marriage deteriorated, so did Joseph's fragile mental state. In 1956, Hilda would leave Joe for another man. This would lead to another mental break for Joe, where he would wake up in another city, not knowing how he got there. But after some brief tests, he was let go. Soon after, he got custody of his kids, where he would often take them on train rides to visit their mother. It was on one of these trips that he met his second wife, Betty Baumgardner. They married in 1958, and Joseph did his best to hide the growing darkness inside of him. At this point, he was becoming a more recognizable figure in the shoe industry and within the community. However, he still needed a knife in his hand to become intimate. In order to hide this weird quirk from his wife, he would create a compartment in the headboard for his knife that he would grab in secret during intimacy. Joseph's psychological deterioration would take a turn for the worse when one day, while working in the shop, he would see a black figure with the witch's hat. The figure would point at another set of figures that would resemble his childhood self and his abusive parents, surrounding a pile of leaves. His father would light this pile of leaves on fire, and Joe felt a sense of excitement. But the vision didn't stop there. It shifted to a memory where Joseph's hand was placed over a stove flame as punishment for his thieving demons. The figure's mouth would then open with flames pouring out of it just before vanishing, leaving Joseph with an eerie sense of clarity. The figure spoke.
Go home. Go burn down your house.
Without hesitation, Joseph rushed home to follow the figure's instructions. He set fire to the family shed, but his first attempt at arson failed. He tried 3 more times before finally succeeding at the age of 30. The house burned down to the ground, with Joseph being charged for arson. However, this charge wouldn't stick. Since Joe was a popular figure in the shoe industry, he made some pretty powerful connections that came to his aid with some character letters that led to the dropped charges. Soon after, Joe would move his family to his childhood home and take over his father's shoe shop. The memories of the abuse he suffered there began to erode his already declining mental health. Never forgetting his mission and believing that he was sent by God to save humanity through shoes, he began conducting bizarre experiments, testing out shoe wedges on anyone willing to try. He even woke up his 4 new children he had with his second wife in the middle of the night to take walks so he could dig through people's trash. This began Joseph's hoarding, collecting shoes, and any items he felt necessary towards his experiments. These experiments soon expanded to his pets. Joseph began creating tiny shoes for his hamsters, but found it impossible to make them small enough. He would even have full-blown conversations with these hamsters because in his deranged mind, they could understand him. He even made a promise to them. If they would follow his instructions, he would make them tiny dresses and suits. Evidently, when they weren't following his instructions, he got frustrated and tortured them and would make them run on their wheel and poke them with a pencil every time they began to stop until they died of exhaustion. This would be Joseph's first taste of killing, a feeling he found disturbingly satisfying. In 1969, the need for more space for his experiments led him to buy his second home, but it also served for a darker purpose, to help him fulfill what he believed was a divine mission to dig a tunnel to hell. In the middle of the night, he would wake his 4 children, where he would take them to the second home and instruct them to dig a 20-foot deep tunnel and banishing them from ever returning back to the home as soon as they finished. He would then use this pit for a self-soothing ritual where he would climb down and relieve himself on his own feces. He found this was the only way he could silence the voices. It was during one of these rituals where he began hearing new voices speak in a language he had never heard before, until one seemed to speak to him directly. It began as a whisper that would grow louder, more insistent, and more disturbing. It was during this session that Joseph believed he had the most divine revelation. He would inflict his childhood abuse and pain onto his children. He rushed to his home into the cellar of his basement to create what he called a torture chamber. He believed that he can control his children through punishment, even claiming that he knew when his children misbehaved because his power hand would begin to itch, and he knew when it was time to punish them because a clock would appear with a skull appearing on 12 that would chime, letting him know that it was punishment time for his children. By 1972, 37-year-old Joseph Kallinger's mental state had deteriorated deteriorated to the point of total delusion. On New Year's Day, he would hear a voice that he hadn't heard since he was 15, the voice of God. Just a couple weeks later, his two eldest children, Mary Jo and Joey, would run away to escape the abuse. When Joe heard the news, he didn't know what to do, so he did the only thing he felt was right. He sat and waited for 2 days until he heard what he was waiting for, the voice of God, with instructions of how to handle the situation. Joseph would get in a cab, tucking a firearm away in his waistband, looking for his children. He stopped the cab outside the movie theater. Seeing his children, he pointed the gun in their face and told them to get in the cab. Once arriving home, he had told his wife to get the other two children and to stay out of the house until he told her it was okay to come back. He chained Joey in the kitchen. With Mary Jo tied down to a chair, he got a spatula, blazing hot, and began to walk towards her, stopping for a moment before branding her on her thigh. Then he would turn to Joey and beat him with the hammer until his arms were too tired. Joseph would then get them pizza and give each of them $5 and felt that he was a good father. A week later, Joseph's two sons, Michael and Joey, would run to the police to tell them of their father's abuse. Instead of getting angry, Joseph would see his children as gods, especially Michael, viewing him as the most complete God. His children's report would lead to Joseph's arrest, and a psych evaluation would have to be done. Surprisingly, he was cleared and released, but the negative press really hurt the business. He then asked his kids to lie to the police and recant their statements. His kids, seeing this as a fun opportunity to fool the police, gladly obliged. Joseph would get another visit from God, but this time Joseph would feel God's scorn since he failed to follow the instructions of God when punishing his kids. See, Joseph didn't mutilate his daughter Mary Jo as instructed. Instead, he branded her. Due to this failure, Joe was to carry out a new mission. He was to kill
3 million people by destroying their sexual organs, and then Joseph would take over as God.
And who better to help than the most complete God, his 12-year-old son, Michael. He would go to his son Michael and tell him of his plan and mission from God to murder 3 million people and that he needed his help. Michael, a deranged child, was more than happy to help. The father and son duo's first murder occurred on July 7th, 1974, when they lured 10-year-old Jose Collazo to an abandoned factory where Joseph brutally mutilated the child and Michael choked him. They then left him there to bleed out, where he wasn't found until days later. Due to the lack of forensic science and evidence, Michael and Joseph were allowed to continue their terror violence. A few weeks later, Joseph, still hearing voices from God, was instructed to kill his own son, Joey, as a sacrifice. He saw a vision of Joey being thrown off a cliff. He and Michael would try to execute this plan, but fail. As a matter of fact, they failed multiple times trying to murder Joey, until finally he was given another vision of the abandoned factories near his home. On July 28th, 1974, Joseph came up with the idea to do a horror photo shoot with his two boys, Michael and Joey. They would walk into the basement of one of these abandoned factories, where they would see a ladder against the wall of a pit that was filled with water. Joseph convinced his son Joey that would be a cool picture if he climbed up on the ladder, back facing to the pit, chained up. Joey agreed, and once he was chained, they pushed him into the pit, watching him until the splashing stopped. Right after, they would call the police and file a missing report for Joey. He wouldn't be found until 2 weeks later. Joseph would then have another child with his wife Betty in order to make up for killing his son. Unfortunately, she was born with a rare, incurable disease that led to purple patches showing up on her skin. It was during this time that Joe heard clear instructions from God on how to cure his child. He needed something from a woman, something he felt that his wife was too old to produce. A woman would be the focus of his next gruesome act. This led to Michael and Joseph getting on a bus to a suburban neighborhood where Michael would scout out for their next mark. On December 3rd, 1974, they would knock on the door of a woman home alone, forcing themselves inside, tying the woman up to the bed. Joseph would then kick out his son Michael. Once in the room alone with the woman, Joe would then envision a double of himself executing his plan on the woman. This excited Joe. When he looked towards the woman and looked back to his vision would disappear along with his desire to kill. Then he would proceed to get what he needed from this woman and leave her alive, confused, and scared. This same incident happened 3 more times. On January 8, 1975, Joseph Kallinger, now in full depths of his violent delusions, arrived at what would become the scene of his final brutal crime. He and his teenage son Michael would force themselves into another home of an unexpected woman. She begged for her life, explaining that she had a sick mother upstairs who depended on her care. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Kallinger was ready to take her life until the doorbell rang. The woman, unknowingly to Joseph and Michael, had planned a gathering, and as each guest arrived, Michael and Joseph greeted them with brutal force, restraining them. Amid this chaos, Joseph claimed that he was guided by visions of flames that surrounded the hallway. Within these flames were distorted faces of all those who had wronged him throughout his life, and amongst these flames appeared a floating head that he would call Charlie. Charlie would give him clear instruction to take the man tied up in front of him and mutilate him. Joseph began to comply, dragging the man downstairs to carry out this gruesome command. Yet at the last moment, something shifted. Kallinger changed his mind, heading back upstairs to confront one of the captives, 21-year-old nurse Maria Fashing. He gave her a choice. Either she bite off his genitals or she die. She chose death instead of surrendering to his twisted commands, prompting Kallinger to stab her repeatedly. He later recounted that in her final moments, she appeared to him as though she was dancing just moments before collapsing. Michael would then yell from the other room, claiming that one of the other hostages had escaped and was running in the streets screaming for help. Michael and Joseph fled the scene before the police could close in. During the rushed escape, Joseph discarded one of his blood-stained shirts into one of the trash bins in the neighborhood, never realizing that this would become key evidence against him. This shirt was soon found by police with the word Kallinger stitched onto the front of it, leading investigators right back to him. This, along with the police sketches made from the earlier home invasions, led to his arrest. On January 7th, 1975, the police raided his home and arrested him. For 8 months, the erratic and unpredictable nature of his attacks, which allowed him to evade the police, were finally over. Michael, only a teenager, claiming to be under his father's control, was placed in foster care, later being taken by one of the relatives on his mother Betty's side, where he would be under probation until he turned 21. Soon after, he would change his last name, disappearing from the public eye. On the other hand, Joseph Kallinger attempted to plead insanity, claiming to be under divine and demonic command. However, the jury rejected his defense, sentencing him to life in prison. Even behind bars, Kallinger's violent tendencies persisted. He started fires and assaulted other inmates, leading to his eventual transfer into a psych hospital for the criminally insane. Yet, despite heavy sedation, his erratic outburst continued, and by 1991, he was placed into solitary confinement, a final isolation that would last until his death in 1996 at the age of 60. Kallinger's life and crime left scars on all those who crossed his path. The mind of Joseph Kallinger, a world consumed by delusion and suffering, became his own prison, one that he would never escape. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content.